In the last 30 years, you can see good evidence that the National Health Service has become a killing machine.
Elizabeth was killed off after I was criminally assaulted and made to have my baby 2 months early for absolutely no reason at all.
As you can imagine, the trauma of watching your perfectly healthy partner of 21 years just die, just like...
She was in no pain, there was no shortness of breath, yet she was on 6 or 7 different forms of medication.
In his medication chart appears he had midazolam and morphine 2 days after he died. Now I want to know what happened with my steward.
She suffered much. She died needlessly. She could have been saved, but she was murdered by the state.
Elizabeth was our firstborn. She was born in 2000, December 2000. She died in December 2001, and her entire life, from the day she was born, was punctuated by abuse, neglect, and negligence. So initially, we were living in Woking, very happy with the care at St Peter's Hospital, as St Peter's were running with a shortage of midwives at that time. So I did as I was told, and I transferred my care to Finney Park Hospital. That's where everything started to go wrong. My baby was scanned at the normal routine 20-week scan, and she was very small for dates. She was right on the bottom centile, and she also had an area in her abdomen that was being picked up by ultrasound where there shouldn't be anything. So I was transferred under the care of a consultant obstetrician, gynecologist called Jane Coburn. So she arranged for me to have twice-weekly checkups in the antenatal clinic in a section called the Day Assessment Unit. So that started just before Elizabeth was born. I went to have a CTG, which is basically a heart trace using ultrasound. And my baby was particularly active. She was also very small, so she was really on the edge of the usefulness or viability of having a CTG, but the hospital didn't realise she was so small. She was moving around a great deal and moving in and out of the beam of the ultrasound, so they weren't getting a good heart trace. It was by that time 5:05, and the midwife wanted to go home. Andrea Fitzgibbon naturally wanted to go home. She said, "Would I mind staying on and having another heart trace? This is the biggest regret of my life." So she arranged for me to go to the maternity unit to have another heart trace. An obstetric registrar, unbeknown to me, had me booked in as a mother with a suspicious, abnormal heart trace on her baby. He put pressure on me to sign a consent form to have my baby early, threatened me with court action in the morning if I didn't sign the consent form. So I ended up in a coerced, uninformed consent situation. I signed the consent form, my baby was born. The paediatric department and the obstetric department thought she was a miracle because apparently she'd been hypoxic and she came out completely able-bodied with absolutely no brain damage at all on ultrasound. So they were busy celebrating that Frimley Park actually had a medical miracle on their hands. But they didn't. The next morning, my obstetrician checked the CTGs. It's very clear she checked and realised her mistake. So she wrote some notes saying she'd passed the decision for the early delivery of my baby on to her registrar, and it was his decision as to whether my baby was born early.
My life has been changed beyond belief. My partner of 21 years, Zion, died from the AstraZeneca vaccine. I met Z when I was 17, just before my 18th birthday. We were finally going to get married in 2020, but because of the lockdowns, that got stopped. It didn't happen. And then in 2021, Z got the call saying that you should go and get vaccinated. We were told at the time, if you get vaccinated, you wouldn't spread COVID, and Z didn't want to be responsible for anyone else being hurt or dying, so he got the vaccine. He got it on the 5th of May. 8 days later, on the Thursday night, his head started to really hurt. It got a bit better during the day on the Friday, but on the Friday night, it got really bad again. He was up and down all night taking painkillers, drinking water. On the Saturday, he didn't get out of bed, and I got worried and I rang an ambulance. The paramedic came. We told the paramedic he had the vaccine 10 days ago. He had the AstraZeneca vaccine 10 days ago. And she completely dismissed it out of hand. Nothing to do with the vaccine. Told us he was having a migraine. Said we could take you to the hospital, but we'd just put you on fluids and give you painkillers like paracetamol and ibuprofen. You can do that at home. And I wouldn't have been able to go with him to the hospital because of COVID. So, you know, we don't want to take up space in the hospital if it's just, you know, a case of drinking water and taking painkillers. So that's what he did. And again, during the day on a Saturday, his headache sort of slightly improved. And during the night, it got worse again, which we now know is caused by the blood pooling in his skull. Increases the pressure on the brain. And so on the Monday, he was starting to slur. His speech was starting to slur. And I rang ambulance again. And while we were waiting for them to turn up, he had a seizure. Sorry.
I could see my baby was very distressed and other babies weren't. They weren't crying like she was. I tried to raise concerns. I was told that there was nothing wrong with my child and they had sick children to deal with, and I was distracting them from dealing with that. Unfortunately, they had a 3-hour break between 12 and 3 when you weren't allowed in to see your baby in those days. During that time, or at the end of that period, something happened to Elizabeth, but no one ever told us about it. She vomited fresh blood and her whole neurological state changed. She vomited so much blood that she had to have a blood transfusion. And at 4 days old, she had very high blood pressure and she became profoundly disabled. She stopped crying at that point in time. We never heard her cry again. They then dumped her on Great Ormond Street. They decided to ventilate her for transfer. They didn't send the medical records with her, which would have shown what happened. It would have shown she had high blood pressure at birth. They hand wrote a 7-page summary that missed the most crucial evidence out. In Great Ormond Street, they based her future care, her procedures, operations on that summary. So we were told there was an outside chance she had a neonatal form of neuroblastoma, which was non-fatal, or should have been non-fatal, and was non-fatal. It never killed Elizabeth. And lo and behold, she did have neonatal neuroblastoma. Initially, they said they weren't going to treat the neuroblastoma. Then, because she was breath-holding, suddenly on a Saturday evening, they decided to start 4 courses of chemotherapy. This was a tiny baby that only weighed, by that time, 3 pounds. The tumour shrank, but she still breath-hold. So then they came up with the idea, well, let's give her a tracheostomy. That will sort that out. Now, they initially looked after it correctly. They maintained and managed it correctly. They were doing all sorts of things to her, and it was clear she couldn't tell them when she was in pain. They were putting lines in her head when they ran out of space on veins in her hands and feet, and no one was giving local anaesthetics. And then they said she had to leave intensive care because, we were told she'd taken up a space for 6 months. They hadn't achieved anything. We were told it had cost £2,000 a day. So she had to leave intensive care. So we thought she would go to the tracheostomy ward. We knew there was a tracheostomy ward called Peter Pan, but no, she was not allowed to go there.
We had expected Elizabeth to be transferred back to her referring hospital, Frimley Park Hospital in Surrey. But Frimley Park, it turned out, had decided they were not going to take Elizabeth back, claiming they couldn't provide the standard of care required.
So we were told Elizabeth couldn't come home, that she either had to go to Tadworth Court in Epsom for the rest of her life, away from her family, or she could come home in a care package, and a care company was suggested by Great Ormond Street.
When the paramedics arrived this time, they knew something was wrong. Z didn't want to get dressed, and he didn't want to go to the hospital, but I was telling him he had to. I was bullying him to get into the ambulance. And I still believed it was a migraine, because I'd been Googling migraines, and I'd read that there were migraines that can present like strokes. I read there are migraines that can prevent you being able to talk properly. So I was thinking, okay, well, this fits with what they told us. I couldn't go with him in the ambulance. I gave him a kiss and I told him I loved him. By the time he was getting in the ambulance, he wasn't really aware much of what was going on. He was starting to be confused and he was starting to find it difficult to follow instructions. I'm really hoping that he really wasn't aware of what was going on. I really hope that he didn't feel I just sent him off in an ambulance on his own. Sorry. So they took him to go to the hospital and they did a scan, and they could see that they had a bleed on his brain. They called me. I was told he was going to be taken to the ward, so I rang the ward and I was told actually he'd been taken directly to surgery. 4:30 in the morning I got a phone call from the surgeon who told me that they had to remove a very large piece of his skull to relieve the pressure on his brain. She said she'd never seen anything like it, and it was a result of the AstraZeneca vaccine. She told me straight out then and there this was caused by the AstraZeneca vaccine. She didn't think he'd ever wake up, and if he did, he would be severely brain damaged. Like severely brain damaged. My friends who live nearby drove me to the hospital. Z's brother drove his mother and father up. We just stayed with him in the hopes that there might be some sort of miracle that he might wake up. He never woke up.
And then they sped up the discharge of Elizabeth. She was to come home via a children's hospice. Now, we thought at the time it was a wonderful idea. We thought it was going to be like heaven. And she went to the children's hospice, and they didn't tell us this, but they were raising concerns about the amount of suctioning they were doing, the amount of tube blockages with the NHS. They were getting through 100 suction catheters a day, and the tube was blocking every 2 days. Now, the hospice was used to patients with tracheostomies, so they knew this wasn't right, and the NHS provided suction catheters without any markers on at all. They were completely blank, so nobody knew how far down they were suctioning Elizabeth and whether they were going beyond the end of the tracheostomy tube, and in fact they were, and they were cutting into her own trachea, and there was blood coming up constantly with secretions up the suction catheters. So Elizabeth came home with nurses that didn't have a clue what they were doing, with a plastic tracheostomy tube, which was blocking all the time, with suction catheters without markers on them. As if that weren't enough, our GP had made a mistake which would prove the other part of the fatal killing of Elizabeth. She'd issued a drug just before we came home, by mistake, because she'd muddled it up with another drug that she was meant to issue a prescription for. Well, here we were, the night Elizabeth died, with a nurse who'd never met Elizabeth. She didn't recognise the tube was blocking at 4 o'clock in the morning. It had only been changed 18 hours before, so it hadn't gone the full 48 hours. But at 2 o'clock in the morning, due to the GP mistake on the second bottle and the drug chart, she'd given Elizabeth a massive dose of morphine. She started to show signs of the tube blocking at 4 a.m. The nurse didn't recognise that, didn't come and get us, did nothing. She left Elizabeth to suffocate, and in the end, Elizabeth's breathing would have been suppressed anyway by the drug overdose. It would have started to kick in. The children's hospice turned up and ordered me to wash down Elizabeth's body, which I had to do in the cot, and I barely even, start to come to terms or realise that she was dead, and I was being asked to strip her and wash her in her cot where she died. And the health visitor turned up, and then we were upstairs after that. We'd redressed Elizabeth, and I'd redressed Elizabeth, and we were upstairs in our bedroom, sitting on the bed, just crying over her. But downstairs, our health visitor was working out why Elizabeth had died and ensuring we didn't find out. She realised Elizabeth had had an overdose, and she knew why. She could see the drug chart with a mistake on it. She could see the GP mistake on the bottle. And she could also see the notes, so she knew Elizabeth had started to suffocate at 4 a.m. And we'd been asleep in our house while our daughter died.
On the 29th of July 2021, our mum, Barbara Clark, was taken into hospital. 2 days before that, we'd lost my dad, and mum was visibly upset. So we'd called an ambulance just so that they could check her out to see if she was okay physically. And they said that her oxygen levels were at 99%. She had a little bit of a temperature, and they could take her into the hospital for observation. So when mum arrived at the hospital, on the notes it does say that she's fit in herself. They were monitoring her oxygen levels. And as the days went by, mum had communicated with most of us in the family by telephone. She was speaking well, speaking clearly, said she wasn't in any pain, but she was still feeling unwell. She just had that general feeling of being unwell in herself. Over the time, we just felt that the hospital kept on introducing a number of different drugs to mum that she wasn't happy to take. So they was encouraging her to take paracetamol, ibuprofen. She refused. And then they put her on oxygen, which she'd accepted some help with the oxygen, even though her levels were between 97 and 99%. Mum started to get quite uncomfortable with the type of oxygen mask that they were giving her. It enabled the staff to force the CPAP mask on her that helped to seize her lungs with the CPAP. As much as it aids the breathing, it can actually help your lungs to seize up, and that's what had happened to mum.
I am a registered nurse. I worked in England since 2013. Before that, I worked in Spain 4 years, and I worked in Italy 4 years. And I worked in my country as a nurse also. My steward was 54 years old when he passed away, and he was put on end-of-life pathway. When he was admitted in the Trellisk Hospital in Cornwall with shortness of breath, 26th of October 2021, he was admitted at 12 o'clock, lunchtime, and 1 o'clock I had a telephone call telling me Stuart has COVID and he's gonna go on end-of-life care and he's gonna have a DNR, not for resus, not for escalation, because he was unvaccinated. So I argued that, and he was put on antibiotics and nebulizers. He started to recover in A&E, and then he was moved by 7 o'clock p.m. to respiratory ward. 27th of October, when the consultant came in the morning, stopped all his medication. He was able to go up and down to the toilet, but they put him in bed and they didn't let him get out of bed. He tried to escape 4 times, is everything in his notes. He had a catheter. My steward did not need a catheter. I tried to argue and I tried to bring him home. They didn't let us go to see him at all. So we had days when not even his sister or his daughter was allowed to go and see him because he wanted to go home, and they didn't let him go home. I had a phone call the 5th of November 2021 from the consultant who was looking after him, telling me Stuart tried to escape again last night and he needed 4 people and the security to pin him down the bed. They gave him in one night 45 milligrams, this is what the doctor said, 45 milligrams of midazolam in 8-hour shift. The night nurse just pumped him with midazolam and morphine. I spoke with the doctor and I said, if you don't take the midazolam out of the system, they're gonna overdose him and they're gonna kill him, which happened. In his medication chart appears he had midazolam and morphine 2 days after he died. Now I want to know what happened with my steward.
The experience my dear husband and I had regarding the death of our daughter needs to be told, because I am not alone. There are far too many people with these tragic stories which ends up with broken marriages and devastation to them for the rest of their life. My daughter Eleanor, at the tender age of 12, went into hospital with just a simple water infection. Unfortunately, the paediatrician did an IVP, which she didn't require, and she had an anaphylactic shock. He then said to put her on Epilim, which is a drug for epilepsy. The GP even wrote into the medical records, "I am somewhat shocked at your diagnosis of Helen Byes having epilepsy." But he still continued to write the prescription pads for the drug Epilim. This drug was on trial at the time, and we didn't know. The both of them worked as a team together regarding her clinical management until March of 1978. By then, she had suffered severe vomiting, most horrendous side effects of the medication. We phoned the University Hospital of Wales, Professor Peter Gray, a man highly renowned for his compassion and care for children. He said he offered us a bed to have her transferred. Unfortunately, paediatrician Trevor Heaven-Jones refused to transfer the child. And he said, "It's my weekend off, and under no circumstances can I transfer the child." He went into the hospital, he removed all medical records, and the registrar on duty said, "I'm sorry, I can't manage the clinical management of dear Eleanor because the records have been taken." 55 hours later, we arrived in Cardiff, and there was no doubt about it, she was dead in that ambulance. And when we got there, she was immediately whipped away. Professor Peter Gray turned to me and he said, "Why didn't you transfer this child last Friday, which was the 21st of April? Professor Gray asked for all details about her clinical management. He said, "I have 4 doctors involved in the clinical management for Eleanor." Over the next 24 hours, Dr. Corrie Weaver came and asked could they take a sample from her liver. She turned to my dear husband and, "Come on, Mr. Bye, don't you want to save dear Helena's life?" And in desperation, he signed. The next day, she came and asked could she do a test on her kidneys. I blankly refused. I said Helena was dead in the ambulance. So she came the next day and they wanted to do a test on her brain. "Don't you want to save your daughter, Mr. Bye?" And he said, "Yes, I do," he said. My husband signed. Unfortunately, we didn't see Eleanor. And we went home. As you can imagine, any parent would be devastated. She died in April the 24th.
In the last 30 years, you can see good evidence that the National Health Service has become a killing machine. Towards the end of the 1980s, in medical, nursing and healthcare practice, the development of evidence-based medicine was seen as very positive. And evidence-based medicine sounded really good because the idea was doctors, nurses and healthcare practitioners are not basing their clinical practice on much evidence or the best evidence or any evidence. So hey, let's make some evidence. Let's look at what really works and apply it. It sounds so believable and so benign. And hey presto, by the 1990s, doctors, nurses, and all healthcare professionals' practice was being geared along protocols, was being geared to protocols, being geared by protocols and shaped by protocols. And once those protocols were instituted, it became very difficult for doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals to use their own clinical acumen with patients. They had to follow protocols. And in those protocols, you've seen the administration of drugs like midazolam in dosages that are potentially lethal.
An NHS protocol says 60 milligrams of midazolam. You don't need to go up to 60 milligrams. You as a doctor, or you as a nurse, you're supposed to think and to watch that patient in front of you to see how he's reacting on medication. You just pump him with medication without even thinking what can happen.
It was paracetamol, it was ibuprofen, it was a list of drugs. And my mum was somebody that would not take medication unless it was essential. A list of drugs that I feel was part of her demise.
The moment they go into hospital, they're being put onto these hospital protocols which dictate which drugs, which treatment they're going to receive. And it's a one-size-fits-all blanket policy. I'm a qualified solicitor, been in law for over 34 years now. I'm also an army officer, not quite retired, and come from 2 military families. I'm also a management consultant, and I used to work at Pfizer as a management consultant. So I come to this situation with those various heads on, analysing medical democide.
In the 1980s, we saw good examples of medical democide. The British government created mass hysteria amongst the population through their advertising campaigns around AIDS and HIV, and the notion that there was a sexually transmitted infection that would kill people. And this created the perception of doom and gloom. I went to work on one of the first HIV wards in the UK at the Middlesex Hospital in London, opened by Princess Diana. Treatment strategy was guided by perceptions of terminality and that these people were dying. And there was very little that we could do to prevent that, except keep them comfortable. And then the new antivirals were brought out, like AZT, zidovudine. And basically what happened was a market was created for those through this terminal approach. So patients jumped at the drugs. You know, the market was there for the HIV positives to consume these drugs. Zidovudine, AZT, created neutropenia. It destroyed the white blood cells, and it had a deleterious effect on people. It had a negative effect on people. So it's very difficult to divide off the mortality and the morbidity associated with the drug from the so-called condition AIDS. I don't think we even talked about treatment protocols in those days. So this is the 1980s, well before evidence-based medicine came in. So what's happened with the institution of the evidence-based approach into nursing, medicine, is that it's become a form of dogma. It's become an ideology. And this is the issue with evidence-based practice, because a lot of the evidence is created around quantitative research and the randomized controlled trial. And that's funded through various funding agencies and also the pharmaceutical industry.
I was a management consultant at Pfizer. Pfizer asked me to come in and help them understand what was going wrong with the business, because they were finding that the scientists weren't inventing and putting out to market enough products. So part of my role was to work with the scientists in the labs to find out how long it takes to invent a product, to get it out to market. These big pharmaceutical companies are money-making businesses. They're not healthcare companies. They are there to make business. And so, of course, what we're finding is that these doctors and medics are being sold, you know, all of these products by these pharmaceutical companies, getting kickbacks from them. So they're profiting from recommending these products that these pharmaceutical companies are telling the doctors are safe and effective. So no individual risk assessments are being carried out. And as we know, people are dying as a result.
She was in no pain. There was no shortness of breath. Yet she was on 6 or 7 different forms of medication.
Remdesivir, they gave him monoclonal antibody, they gave him everything. They use him as a guinea pig.
Helena Bai was the first fatal case of the drug epilin inducing hyperammonemia of the brain. drugs given to children are not licensed. It's the luck of the draw, whether they benefit or is causation of death.
And then children are also a market for unlicensed medications. Many medications given to adults are not licensed for children. But of course, the regulators have waved this through. They've told people that it's safe. They've concocted and confected evidence with the pharmaceutical industry to show it's safe. So, hey presto, you've got to take this medication.
When you do a multi-center study, which I have done, you look very, very carefully at mortalities. You look very carefully at the negative sides of medications, and you balance them very, very carefully. If there's a slight statistical imbalance, that drug will get thrown out.
And once procedures are put into a protocol, it becomes a straitjacket for doctors and nurses to wriggle out of. They have to administer these drugs. They have to do as they're told. And this is totally antithetical to healthcare training, where you train people to be autonomous practitioners and, yes, to work with the evidence base, but not to apply things rigidly to everybody in the population. You've seen a lot of this in the last 2 years with these midazolam protocols in COVID. You've seen it in relation to the ventilator deaths. So instead of giving people a nebulizer with a beta-2 agonist like Ventolin, they were actually electively sedating people and intubating them and putting them in intensive care units. So no wonder there was high mortality from that.
He was on blood thinner medication, everything was stopped, and he was put on midazolam and morphine. A CPAP machine was put on him. A CPAP machine is blowing oxygen in your lungs with pressure. It's a very dangerous machine if you don't know how to work with it, because you can destroy the lungs of the person is a CPAP machine. The nurses, you can see, they don't understand the impact of the CPAP on your lungs. They don't know how to adjust it. They just follow orders, and they don't think the gravity, and they don't think the outcome of these orders.
So take the ventilators, for example. You know, nurses have come out and said they're having nightmares because they now realise that they probably kill people by using that. And it was just a bog standard treatment. So yes, they're literally playing God. People's lives in their hands, shove them on this treatment, put them on this protocol, and they're just being treated essentially like cannon fodder, medical experimentation. And it's horrifying. And I'm dealing with people who have not only lost loved ones in the hospital through those protocols, but, I'm dealing with people at work who are being forced in those protocols as well. So the corporates are also making their staff take all these medical interventions, playing God with their lives. And again, doing no risk assessment, not actually caring, frankly, if any of their staff die from any of these protocols and mandates. They're just doing it, playing God with people's lives.
There's nothing absolutely specific about the symptoms of COVID. The whole industry that's been built up around it is created on the perception of fear. And once you've got fear, you've got a coercion in the population. You can coerce people, you can make them comply, and you can basically market drugs and antivirals, vaccines.
All these people just did what they were told was the right thing to do, and none of them were at risk. All the people that have died or been severely injured, they were doing it because they were trying to protect others. I became aware that they were starting to roll out these vaccines to 18-year-olds. And I got absolutely terrified that more people would die. So I got really panicked. And I rang the BBC, ITV, Sky, all the places I could think of, and said, I need to talk about this because I need to let people know. As a caveat for even being allowed to do this, I had to say the vaccines were safe and I was going to get vaccinated. And everyone should definitely get the vaccine because it's the right thing to do. But be aware, there can be side effects. At the time, they told us it's a 1 in a million chance. And for a while, I believed that. I discovered afterwards that Lisa Shaw, the Look North presenter, was in the same ward at the same time. She died 2 days later of the exact same thing.
But I think coming back to the COVID injections, there's huge amounts of data there to examine. It'd be very difficult to prove cause and effect, that those injections caused the conditions that have been reported, the adverse events and the mortalities, unless there are autopsies done on those deaths. And that's what we should be calling for, and people should be asking for, is autopsies on people who've died. And there should be series of autopsies done on these vaccine-associated deaths. Why not? The issue of regulation is very important because there are many regulators of the healthcare professions, the General Medical Council, the Nursing and Midwifery Council, and then the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, MHRA, and also the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, called NICE. I would question whether these regulators who produce these death protocols, are they independent? And the answer is no. A lot of these COVID protocols in the last 2 years came from the World Health Organization. The NHS was in tow, had lost its own scientific sovereignty to dictate how it's going to test and treat people.
So, for example, with these injections, we know for a fact that there are a number of undisclosed ingredients in the injections, and we know that because the MHRA was challenged, the Medicines and Healthcare Regulation Authority was challenged, and they said that we respect the manufacturer's right to keep their commercial interests secret. It's like a secret recipe. So the commercial interests have been put above the need for the public to be informed of exactly what's in those injections.
These precautionary principles that we've always had in health sciences in this country have been put to one side, been put in the bin basically, because profits count more than human life.
These doctors are paid to do what they're doing. For pocket money, they will follow whatever and put you down like a dog.
Why they are allowing such a massive number of injuries and deaths to happen for a vaccine which doesn't prevent you getting ill. All I can think is it's to do with money. Someone's getting very bloody rich off of this.
Nobody's asking the right questions, and the shareholders are profiting enormously. I think Pfizer's been claimed to make something like £47 billion from these injections. So the shareholders are happy, and meanwhile people across the globe have been killed, injured, maimed or disabled by it. So that's what we're dealing with, a money-making, potentially fraudulent, certainly historically criminal enterprise. So one of the alarm bells for me right at the beginning was when, the government, etc., was saying we've got a safe and effective vaccine. And I thought there's absolutely no way you can produce that in that time period. And the reason I cite to people is because if you have to follow someone up for 2 months or 6 months or a year, 2 months is 2 months. You can't buy 2 months into a short time frame. So the idea that they were throwing money at it that meant that they could produce something safer was a nonsense. So that was a flag for me. Any clinician who's recommending these products, if they don't know the ingredients, they cannot claim that they're safe and effective because they don't know what they are and they can't assess what it's going to do to your body, so they can't tell you what the risk is. And that's an absolute breach of the law of informed consent. And in fact, the leading case on that is the Montgomery versus the Lanarkshire Health Board, 2015 Supreme Court judgment. Lady Hale specifically says that the requirement for informed consent is now firmly established as part of English law. And when she talks about what that means, she says that the medic must tell the person the material risks of the intervention, the treatment. And the material risks means, how it is going to specifically harm you as an individual, having had a full clinical risk assessment. So this isn't happening, not just in terms of these injections, but it's not happening with the masks, it's not happening with the tests, it's not happening when people are in hospital.
We hadn't known about these side effects. There was nothing in the paperwork that Z was given when he got the vaccine about blood clots. It was all just like, you might feel a bit fluey for a few days, but it's fine. That was all the information we were given.
The doctor put him on midazolam and morphine without our consent and without even telling us.
Unknown to me, my obstetrician in her career at Frimley Park very often got women to sign consent forms when they were uninformed consent and carried out unnecessary procedures and harmed women. I didn't know anything about this till many years later.
The European Court of Human Rights, for example, has decided on various cases which says if you give medical treatment without consent, then it is a form of torture, cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment. Okay, so again, that's an inalienable right that nobody has the right to breach, is a right that cannot be derogated from, even in times of war. When I'm out and about on the rallies and people are saying to me, you know, we don't know where we stand with our human rights, the first thing I say to them is, well, in this jurisdiction, we have several bodies of law and we don't have a written constitution. And what I've found from the rallies is that actually we haven't been taught law at school for generations in this country. But what people need to understand is, whilst they might turn around and blame the state for the lack of their legal knowledge, the way our rule of law works is that every single person is individually liable for their actions and omissions in law. The medics in particular, they've told me, every single one of them I've spoken to, both here and abroad, because I'm working with these multidisciplinary teams around the world, every single one of them has told me that they don't know the law. And on top of that, the actual GMC, the General Medical Council, and the Nursing and Midwifery Council produces guidance on issues such as informed consent. So in the GMC code, it says you must uphold the rule of law. And then they have a whole leaflet about the informed consent laws. Now, I've read that stuff, but it appears that all the medics and the doctors I've spoken to, apart from a handful, haven't bothered to read it. Haven't read their code, haven't read their employment contracts, certainly haven't bothered to read this specific guidance about the law of informed consent. It's like, who do these people think they are? That even when they're actually told by lawyers, you're breaking the law and you will be held liable, it doesn't apply to us.
So you do not have a clear guidelines in hospitals how much subcut midazolam you can give to a person. The staff, they do not have the training to know what midazolam does. They don't know.
I want to know why the paramedic hadn't been given the up-to-date information on this vaccine, because we later discovered there was a protocol issued the month before telling people what to look out for with these symptoms within 7 to 30 days of getting the AstraZeneca vaccine. So he had 5 of these 7 symptoms. He should have been rushed to hospital. Why didn't she have this information? Why was it not disseminated properly? Who's to blame for that?
This is absolutely appalling that this has been allowed and people have got away with it. You know, I think that this is what needs to happen. There needs to be a full and public reckoning of the morbidity and mortality and the intentions of agencies within those systems that we're talking about. So there's got to be an accountability here. We'll have to end up in the courts of law.
By the end of it, I want those 2 doctors, Craig Leaper and Hannah Barrett, to be held accountable. I'm going to take those 2 to court and have them prosecuted. I'm going to keep going, I'm going to keep digging, and I'm not going to stop, because I go to bed at night thinking about my mum. I wake up every morning thinking about her. If she was dying of cancer or something like that, and I knew she was going to die, but when someone takes a life, someone that is perfectly okay, and kills them, this to me is not good. So I'm looking for justice. I'm still going to look for justice. Those 2 doctors were playing God, for sure. They were killing people.
In the Second World War, for those of you who don't know, unfortunately, the medics of the Third Reich were conducting medical treatment and experimentation on people without their consent lawfully given. And so what happened was, of course, through these experiments, including vaccination experiments for typhus, for example, many people were maimed, disabled, died. And at the end of the war, those medics were brought to trial in the Nuremberg trials, the International Military Tribunal. And the doctors of the Third Reich were brought to trial based on the fact that even at that time, they were in breach of the existing medical code of ethics and the existing laws.
As time went on, I did become more proactive. I applied to the VDPS, Vaccine Damage Payment Scheme, and I discovered that there are over 2,000 people waiting for their claims to be processed by the VDPS. Some of those people have been waiting over 18 months. They have confirmed death certificates, and yet they haven't had any help. And the help that is available is complete bullshit. £120,000 for a life. £120,000 that you have to live off of when you've been left over 60% disabled, because that's the criteria. You have to be at least 60% disabled. So how far does £120,000 go these days? When you've got to fit in a stair lift, you've got to refit your bathroom so you can actually use it, your husband or wife is now your full-time carer, neither of you can work anymore, you have to pay for physiotherapy because the NHS stops sending you physiotherapists after 6 weeks. How far does £120,000 go? I was the first person to get a payment from them, and I've seen their internal memos about me, and I'm pretty certain I was the first person because I talked to the media a lot about it. Another thing that I discovered with the vaccine damage payment scheme is that it's not meant to preclude anyone who receives a payment from it from seeking litigation elsewhere, so going after the vaccine manufacturers, for example. But at the same time, all the vaccine manufacturers for the COVID-19 vaccines have been granted immunity from prosecution by our government. So I did a Freedom of Information request asking the government specifically what would make the immunity granted to AstraZeneca null and void. They came back and said, we do hold the information you've requested, but the short version is we're not going to tell you because we think it would affect the commercial interests of government and the vaccine manufacturers if we told the public this information.
Throughout Elizabeth's life and after her death, there was a constant cover-up. The CQC said they would do an investigation, but NHS England stopped it. The CQC were going to be transparent, we were going to be involved and see a draft report. NHS England then came on board on their own, and then Jeremy Hunt announced that Bill Kirkup was going to do the investigation. Bill Kirkup came to our house, he groomed us, he made us believe that he was going to be honest, he was going to do forensic examination, he wouldn't sweep the truth under the carpet, he went through Elizabeth's, how she got the overdose and everything with us and looked at the paperwork for that. He said it was privileged to investigate and that he would point out all the different areas where things could have been done differently and would have saved Elizabeth. And then the report was published, and then we saw it after it was published. We never saw a draft. We had no involvement apart from that one meeting I had with him in London, which he shut me down in. And I was horrified, absolutely horrified. I don't want any other family to go through what we've been through. All my years of work, all my longing for Elizabeth to make a difference has all been squandered by a perfect public cover-up of everything that everybody knew we'd worked out and had proven. I wanted Elizabeth to be the catalyst also for a paediatric early warning system so that people in paediatrics would know there'd been issues in scans in pregnancy. Jeremy Hunt's done absolutely nothing, and it's just all been buried.
They couldn't even apologise for what had happened. And the behaviour of all the staff involved. When a colleague does a mistake in a hospital, there is no provision for that man to go to a department and say, I made a mistake, I apologise, and there should be an emergency meeting with the parents or family relatives present to hear what happened, how it happened, could it have been avoided, and more importantly, it doesn't happen again. The wheels of cover-up and deceit continues. The inquest was a farce. As far as I'm concerned, the coroner's inquest is an outdated ritual. People involved in a clinical management at the University Hospital of Wales. Nobody was called to give evidence. Our medical records went missing for 20 years. The health authority, the chief executives, they're all involved in the cover-up. They were more concerned about saving Dr. Trevor Jones's professional position.
We did report this to the police. We did report this to the CQC. We raised concerns with the hospital. So they had a meeting all together, the coroners with the police, with CQC, and the report came back, my steward had outstanding care in Treliske Hospital. Too bad he died.
When you go to a hospital, like a national health hospital, you go there to be cured. However ill, however old, You go to be cured, you don't go there to die, and your relatives wouldn't take you there if they thought that you were going there specifically and that was what was going to happen. I'm particularly motivated about what is going on in the NHS, something that some colleagues and I had brought to light in 2013 with the Liverpool Care Pathway. The Liverpool Care Pathway arose out of the hospice movement. It was thought that this pathway that helped people to die without pain would be useful in the NHS hospitals too. But in fact, how it has turned out, it has been disastrous.
We never wanted Elizabeth to suffer. That was always our aim for our child, was that she didn't suffer. We just wanted to have the best quality of life she could have. But she always was suffering because of the way they behaved. And then the hospice were putting on the Liverpool Care Pathway.
Stuart was a very lovely man. He was a wild soul, very caring. He was my brother, my father, my lover. He was an amazing man. 25th of December 2020, he had a minor stroke, but he couldn't work anymore, so he was on personal people allowance. So because of that, I think he was flagged in the system, and that's why he needed to be put on end-of-life care.
So the Liverpool Care Pathway included 2 drugs, midazolam and morphine. Those 2 drugs are never given together because they both cause suppression of respiration and sedation together. In fact, if you look at the British National Formula, you'll see that there is a contraindication that those drugs are dangerous given together.
When you start to have midazolam in combination with morphine, the kidney function will go down. Because the kidney function are going down, your lungs will be flooded with fluid.
And suddenly she went from, well, she doesn't cry, she's not showing any indication she's in pain or suffering, to seeing a symptom care consultant who gave not 1, but 2 forms of morphine to her. They're prescribed on a regular basis, not actually licensed for a baby under 1, let alone a baby who at that stage was weighing 7 pounds, like a newborn, and she was giving, even then, substantial amounts of morphine.
There are multiple effects that this pathway has had, multiple serious, very negative effects. People who lose their loved ones, they're terribly grieved. They feel, why didn't I do something about it? So there's also a huge guilt that they have to carry. So they go home guilty and bereaved. And it's a terrible thing to do to relatives, particularly when they brought their loved one into a hospital to be cured.
I try to argue and I try to fight to take him home. And I told them, you are killing him, because as a nurse, I know when midazolam is used in combination with morphine. I was threatened because I am not English, I'm from Romania. I'm gonna be deported, I'm gonna be arrested. They didn't let me go to see him for 11 days.
So I was on a lot of medication. As you can imagine, the trauma of watching your perfectly healthy partner of 21 years just die, just like kind of screws you up a bit.
So best interest groups are set up of people of varying backgrounds who know the individual person in whom the decision is being considered. And a decision of whether to put somebody on end-of-life care is taken by this group. But this is no longer science. When you start making decisions by a group like that, you've departed from science. You start to go down a pathway that has never been used before. Somebody witnessed a consultant going past the bed of a patient in the morning, and the first time they'd seen this patient, and they stopped momentarily at the end of the bed without examining the patient, and they said, end-of-life pathway, and moved on to the next one. I could not believe it. So basically, it changes the people who use it. The nurse teams, it changes the doctors, and gradually they get desensitized to what should not be practiced. And it's undermining medical ethics, because You have doctors who subscribe to the Hippocratic Oath and who would in no way voluntarily kill somebody, allowing these pathways to be used on their patients because they are end of life. They used to audit the pathway very carefully, and they found that the average time to death from the time starting the pathway till the time the person died was about 39 hours. It really has to stop. It has to stop.
I think you should reconsider this treatment of midazolam and this end of life in NHS hospitals.
You have the inalienable fundamental right to life, and no one has the right to take that away from you. In our society, we allow for killing by mistake and intentional murder. And what I liken it to is the film Mad Max, which was a completely lawless society. But essentially, whose fault is that? Under the human rights instruments, particularly the international covenants on, the international human rights covenants, it specifically places an obligation on the state who gives an undertaking. So it's the most, serious promise you can give that they will respect, promote, uphold, etc., human rights.
So 4 health ministers of our government were aware that that drug was harming children. These medical profession become dehumanized. We had a letter from the chief executive of the University Hospital Wales. With Helena's body parts was found, her brain in Oxford, body parts found in Southmead Hospital. Body parts were sent to the Royal Free Hospital in London. All this was going on without our knowledge regarding Helena. This is not the Nazi movement, but the National Health Service.
The tracheostomy tube was incompatible with any patient with thick, sticky, copious secretions because it was made of plastic. And unbeknown to us, Great Ormond Street were aware of that, as were the NHS in the community. And in fact, they were liaising to provide a different type of tracheostomy tube to Elizabeth. But no one told us. Clearly, she'd be suffering and couldn't tell people. And I was trying to explain that. And they weren't taking any precautions at all. It was a nightmare. I likened it to being in a Nazi concentration camp and being experimented on. Couldn't tell people if she was suffering at all, and they weren't paying any attention. If she didn't cry, it didn't matter. They did whatever they wanted to her. The hospice were cutting into Elizabeth's own trachea. Blood was being suctioned up here all the time. She was having constant bronchospasms where they were touching inside her trachea in a place called the carina. And so I raised concerns with the NHS.
It's been known for over 20, 30 years, I think, that these types of vaccines, if injected intravenously, can cause blood clots. I do know that the MHRA, who are meant to regulate these vaccines and keep an eye on the yellow card reporting for safety, they have no plans to look at the yellow card reports. Why? Why tell people to make these yellow card reports and then do nothing with the information when you know that thousands of people are dead? It's beyond belief.
The MHRA yellow card scheme was invented to pick up adverse events. The way it works is it's self-report data, which means it's only as good as the people who report it. So if the people don't report it, it doesn't happen. And there's been lots of studies done on that form of data collection to show that as much as 90% or even more of side effects don't get reported. People don't report them, doctors don't report them, because there's an embargo on reporting. Some doctors are frightened to report side effects after a COVID vaccine, COVID injection, because they feel they're being put at risk in the hospital they work in, or they're told not to by managers because of the overwhelming belief that these things are safe.
It's interesting that when you look through the doctor's reports, they mention a number of times that my mum had just lost her husband, my dad, and they'd been together for almost 60 years. And she was clearly distraught, she was upset, she was grieving, but not once was there any sort of emotional support given to Mum. There was no counsellors on hand. There was no one that could have talked her through just how she might have been feeling at that time. It was very much based on how much medication can we give this patient. So she is hurting, but it's not physical pain. She was more in emotional distress.
So that junior doctor saw me. She knew I'm a nurse. So she saw me. I am watching the monitor. And she came and she stopped the monitor. And then a nurse came with 5 syringes, 10 ml syringes on a blue trail. She pushed through up his cannula and he stopped breathing in my arms. She killed him. I was holding him, I was having him in my arms. Sorry.
But thou shalt not kill goes into the New Testament and a softer version of love thy neighbour, do no harm to each other. And our common law position is prima non nocere, first do no harm. And that's enshrined in the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. And it goes across all of our laws. And yet we're seeing our human rights being trashed across the world, not just in this country. Any medic who's giving any kind of treatment must first understand that they have no right to take away from those people's rights, even in a public health emergency. So all the abuses of the human rights that are being justified on the grounds that we're in a public health emergency is null and void and no effect, because they don't have that right to derogate. So people might claim the right, but they have to prove that they have the right. The burden of proof is on them. When I call out the doctors and the medics, they are ashamed. They are horrified because they realise that what I'm saying is in fact true. And so I say, so how do we move forward from here? Because if all of you medics are giving medical treatment and performing these experiments without lawful consent, how are you upholding the law? You're not. But they don't even know they're not upholding the law because they're ignorant of it. We know that God is the only one who grants and takes away the life, and yet these medics are placing themselves in the position of God and deciding who shall live and who shall die.
There is no scientific way of choosing who is dying. There's no way at all. It doesn't happen. And if you try to do it, you get it wrong. As a priest, I would like to mention one area which has not received attention. What is happening by taking people who are not dying and suddenly putting them in a situation where they're sedated and drowsy, and then they die, what you're doing is killing somebody without allowing them to get ready for death. There is a process that you go through in the last few days of your life when you start to realize that you are dying, but that takes time. You go through a state of anger, denial, and then finally acceptance. We need patients to be able to communicate. We need patients to be able to face death in a natural way and not in a manufactured way. We all have to pray that this will change for us, that it will change for the NHS. And I pray every day that this may happen. And please God, it will.
In the late 1990s and early 2000s, inquiries like the Shipman inquiry into Harold Shipman, the GP that killed hundreds of people in Manchester, was used as a way of disciplining the medical and healthcare professions. This tightening of regulation coincided with tightening the government control over the National Health Service through the Department of Health. Because GPs, since the end of the Second World War, when the NHS was created, were always non-NHS employees. So each person in general practice is employed by the practice, not by the NHS, irrespective of whether they've got the NHS sign on the side. So there's also a way of controlling them through evidence-based practice and clinical commissioning, was to bring them into this a whole way of thinking that they've got to do one thing to every patient with the same diagnosis. They've been told that these are the protocols to follow, and if they don't, they're going to hurt the patient. Rather than looking at it from the other perspective of the patient's perspective.
In the time that she was in that hospital, 12 days, she was never given any emotional support. Her main concern was everyone in the family, which is typical of mum. She was interested to know from the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and, you know, she was just always had everyone else's interests at heart.
My steward was starved for 11 days. He didn't have any water, he didn't have any food for 11 days. Is everything recording in his notes?
We've had lots of instances of this in history where healthcare professionals have been taken over by government policy and have been told what to do by governments. And that's basically what's happened today. We need to come away from allopathic approaches that are enshrined in government policy and regulatory protocols, because they're literally killing people at the moment. The intentionality that we need to discuss and need to uncover, what are the intentions within that system? Any one part of that system, the intentions may look, on the face of it, quite acceptable and quite benign, but overall the systemic effects are very negative and harmful. People have to take the action themselves. This won't change until the individuals change.
Well, now that we know that we have all these people in society who are committing these heinous acts against the rest of us, we have to act. First of all, it's our duty. It's a constitutional duty, and not a lot of people are aware of that. But everyone has a constitutional duty and a legal duty to act to prevent harm. It's not a choice. It's not a discretion. You must act. And if you fail to act, you can be held liable for omitting to act. We have to all keep shouting from the rooftops about what's going on. We have to take action, including reporting crimes to the police, including contacting our MPs, including going to all of these perpetrators, the schools, the GP clinics, all these people who are causing the harm, and carry on. You must keep shouting about this, because that's the only way to get people out of their conditioning, brainwashing, their complicity, if you like. So I know it doesn't sound like a magic answer that will solve it tomorrow. This is years of work that we're going to have to put into sorting this out. But the other thing I would say is that I personally would be calling for each medic to go through an exam on the basics of law, particularly on the right to bodily integrity, the right not to receive medical treatment without consent. It's clearly a key fundamental issue. And they should actually have a licence. You know, I have to have a licence to practice law, but these medics are practising legal decisions all the time. No licence, no test. So that has to be fixed.
My biggest wish is to wake up as many people we can. We need more nurses and more doctors to stand up. Now is the time when you're supposed to be brave and you're supposed to fight, because you're not fighting for yourself, you're fighting for the future of your children. How is it going to be in 10 years' time when somebody will decide your son or your daughter is not worth to live?
She was cremated and then everybody had vanished. It was like our daughter hadn't existed, and we subsequently found out that the health authority, the community nurses and Dr. Tettenborn's monthly meetings had erased Elizabeth. She was taken off the list. There was no serious case review. Nobody wanted to speak to us. It was like we didn't exist, wasn't it? We couldn't get hold of anybody. The only thing we got was a letter from Great Ormond Street from the genetics department asking for more tissue sample of Elizabeth because they were running out and she'd just been cremated.
And I think it's important to be a voice for other people that feel that they've been victim of medical negligence or that they've not received appropriate care in hospital, that it's okay to have a voice and speak up and question what has happened.
I don't know what my future's going to be anymore. All I know now is to fight for the people who've been injured, the people who've been bereaved, fight to get us recognition, fight to get us the help that we deserve, and fight against the way we've been treated. And someone's got to answer for it one day. Someone's got to answer for it.
The medical profession is very powerful, and as we all know who have lost loved ones, feel deep down in their heart Why didn't somebody listen? Why didn't somebody help at the time of the loss of our loved one? And there are many, many people in the medical profession I've spoken to over the years, and they said, it's more than what our job is worth to speak out what may have happened to your loved one. It's time for us to begin to realise that there's got to be great changes in the health service. There is a way forward. First of all, as united we stand and divided we fall. If we wait for the politicians, wait for the chief executive of hospitals, wait for the health ministers, they're all in the game of playing Russian roulette with the lives of people. And those that are sitting on the fence, please, let us see change, which we desperately need within the health service. Medicine should be available at the point of need with compassion and care and honesty and truth. That's the only way we can improve the quality of people's lives.